Hey y'all, this is Danielle here with Sustaining Way, and welcome back to the 5th installment in our gardening workshop series, Compost. I'm a sustainable agriculture coordinator here, and if you're new or rejoining Sustaining Way is an interfaith nonprofit that uses education, collaboration, advocacy to create sustainable, caring, and equitable communities for current and future generations. The gardening workshop series is a part of our backyard garden program, in which we are seeking to propagate a lot of the natural gardening principles that we implement here at Annie's house to backyards in Nicholtown to increase local fresh food access. And during today's compost workshop, we'll focus on the basics of compost, some of our composting practices, ways that you can transform this in your own backyard or in your own space, as well as the benefits of composting. And let's take it away to our compost area, and Alicia will talk more about that.
Hello, so I'm Alicia Clayton, and I'm one of the Sustainable Agriculture and Community Engagement interns. So I'm going to kind of just go through and give you an overview about composting. And so what exactly is composting? Composting is a natural process that breaks down organic matter like food scraps, cardboard, eggshells. And this process normally happens in like forest ecosystems. And so any kind of like plant matter, dead animals, animal droppings get broken down by microorganisms, fungi, air and water or rain. And so with composting, we kind of speed up this process because typically this process happens it takes like a year or so. And so composting helps kind of speed up that process because we're adding in all of those elements all at once. And so a few things that you will need is you'll need some gloves, unless you don't mind getting your hands dirty. You'll also need a compost bin, and Xana will kind of go through and show you like the different ways you can set up your compost. You also need a shovel, like this, some water, and food scraps. And so you'll need greens or browns or carbon and nitrogen inputs. And so for carbon, which are browns, you'll need, it can be either, like here we have corn husk, cardboard, paper towels. For greens, you can use tea, plants, food scraps.
Grounds here too. I kind of hid them with our signs, but I think of it as like carbon, and nitrogen.
Should you compost? So composting is a really great way to get some organic fertilizer, because once this all kind of decomposes, you can put it back in your garden and it will help fertilize the soil. It also helps with food waste, and so typically in landfills, sometimes the food won't decompose all the way because the landfill is so compact, so none of the air is getting to the waste, and so it's not able to decompose. And also it will help make your trash less stinky.
Hey everyone, I'm Xana, a Sustainable Ag Coordinator here at Annie's house. And as you heard from Danielle and Alicia, today we're talking about how you can compost at home. And so I wanted to show you all the different methods that we've been using at Annie's house, our demonstration site. And so the first example is how we have a kind of pallet box here in our chicken coop. And so really a great thing about chickens is that they will help you compost. And as you can see here, this is some really nice looking soil. It also has some chicken droppings in it, so be mindful of that if you're playing around in here like I am right now. But the cool thing is when we throw food waste in here, and we were doing this all summer, is that the birds help by eating what they want, and then as they're eating the food they want, they're also scratching around and helping break it down and kind of turn it for us, so you don't have to turn it manually as much. And then because it has chicken droppings in it, you do want to make sure that if you apply this to your garden that you are letting it lie for at least 6 months, so that you're not contaminating any food with chicken manure. But if you're growing something that's not edible, just decorative plants, it's fine if the chicken manure goes in sooner. So we really like this method, again, because the chickens help us out. And I've even seen methods where people throw all their food scraps in here, let it pile up nice and high, let the chickens break through it, and have a really fast system where they'll like break down the pallet, set it back up in a different location in their coop, which is pretty cool. And if you don't have chickens, we'll show you other methods you can use. So our next method of composting we want to show you is vermicomposting, and the prefix vermi just means worm. And so composting with worms is a really neat way to speed up the composting process. Like Alicia mentioned, it's a process that can really take a long time, but because we're able to kind of aid it by adding things to our food waste, we can speed this along, and worms really help us do that. So you can see here, this bin is a really neat size because you could put this on your porch, or you could even do something smaller with worms, like a bucket. And because they're helping break down the food waste pretty quickly, it doesn't really get stinky. And so if you check out this bin here, you can see there's quite a bit of waste that hasn't broken down, just like the paper that the worms aren't going to be eating, but you have a lot of this really nutrient-dense compost already. And that's basically just what the worms have already processed and pooped out. So these are specifically red wiggler worms. There's a lot of worm varieties out there, but only a few that really help us compost in this way. So you can see those red wigglers, and if you are interested in adding these to your compost bin or starting up a compost bin, we would be more than happy to just give you some worms, because we have hundreds, if not thousands, in here. And so again, this is just a really cool way to compost in a small environment. So if you don't have chickens to help you, or you don't want to do a large system like we're about to show you, I really recommend vermicomposting. I've seen people even keep a container of worms just under their kitchen sink. So, I mean, not just worms, it's also a little bit of bedding material like paper, but the point is it's really easy to just feed your food scraps to the worms, and you could even forego having bigger tools just by having a little hand trowel or something like that to help mix everything up. So this is pretty fun to do when you don't have a lot of space. And then, contrary to popular belief, earthworms don't actually become 2 earthworms if cut in half. I just like to bust that myth from time to time. Some worms do, but those are like flatworms and nematodes, not the red wiggler. So, you know, maybe don't cut them in half if you can help it. Our next composting system is kind of in between like a worm bin and a big system, because it's actually, as you can see, you know, designed for composting. It's got these nice holes for aeration, which is a really important part of composting. It's got a lid, so you could really prevent plants from growing in your compost bin if you kind of keep light out. But some people really like to let the plants grow because it's usually food plants that are growing. So here we actually have avocado trees sprouting up, which is pretty cool. We had our lid off so that it could get some rain washed through it, but the lid is a great way to suppress any plant growth. And when you have a plant growing in your compost bin, that's called a volunteer, and you could definitely transplant it out of there into your garden. But unfortunately, avocado trees don't do too well here in the winter, so it would be a bit of a waste unless you know of a trick to grow avocado trees here. And then it's also neat because, you know, it's designed for composting with the intention that if you're putting food on top, you're going to be getting your material from the bottom of the bin, and you don't have to dig through the whole entire thing to get out that good soil. So there's a few weeds growing out of there right now because it had light exposure. But if you go a little deeper, you can see we've got this nice darker material that's a lot smaller and broken down. And so that's compost, and that would be great for the garden. You can also see there's like a produce sticker here. And, you know, if you want to be very strict about your composting, you could obviously keep that out. But at the end of the day, it's not too hard to just remove that later on in the process. So I wouldn't worry too much if you're new to composting and don't want to have to worry about little details like peeling every sticker off your produce. So that's pretty neat because you could do that with or without worms. And if you want to speed it up, you could add some water from time to time. And you could also mix it up from time to time. That can aid in the process. And then you might notice it's dark because that absorbs sunlight, and so that's also going to help that heat be maintained. And that's really important if you live in a place where it's mostly cold. At least here we have heat, you know, at least half the year, so our compost is on a pretty speedy schedule. Here's another thing that some aluminum ended up in our compost recently, and you know, not too hard to just pull that out when you're moving your compost finally to your garden. So don't stress if trash occasionally ends up in there. But we did want to run through the process of how we do compost in the 3-step way, and we highly recommend this if you actually have the space to do it, and if you want to compost a lot, to have a lot of your garden fertilizer being produced at your own place. You know, the bigger your compost system, obviously, the more effectively you can do that without having to buy an outsourced fertilizer. So the first step here would be, like Alicia mentioned, to have your nitrogenous waste, your food waste, going into this first bin. So here you can see we've got some moldy okra. Unfortunately, that was left over. And it's best not to waste food, so, you know, sad day, but hopefully you're just bringing us food scraps or something, right? But also coffee grounds are a source of nitrogen. And what you can also do if you're collecting compost at your house is go ahead and mix in your carbon sources in your bin, because that's going to help it from getting too stinky or liquidy. You know, the carbon can help absorb some of that liquid too as you go. You could also freeze your compost to prevent it from attracting flies in your house, or you could even just store it outside in the inner room between you collecting it and actually dumping it in a compost bin. So we'll add in our nitrogen and a little bit of carbon. And then once you've got that in there, it's also important to add in your carbon sources. So we've got this graphic. If you choose to compost with us instead of building your own at-home system, you'll see these instructions, and we'd be happy to walk you through it as well. So we explain what brown and green material is, like we talked about earlier, and it's important to have a mix of both. And actually, the higher amount of nitrogenous material that's in your compost, the more nutrient dense it's going to be. But the higher amount of carbon in your compost, the less likely it is that you'll encounter unpleasant odors. So we like to add a lot of carbon. So we've got some corn husks, like we talked about, that we could add in. We could tear up this box and add it in if we wanted to. And if you compost over here, you'll also get to see this guide of some do's and don'ts of composting. So there's always exceptions. And what I like to say is, like, you can compost almost everything, but depending on what you're trying to do, you may not want to compost everything. For example, if you compost fish, you're going to attract your stray cats to your compost bin. So we recommend that you don't do that. If you compost raw meat here, you might even attract something a little more unpleasant than a stray cat. You might attract some other animals that you do not want hanging out at your house. If you compost huge logs, you know, ultimately, like, you know, in a forest environment, those would break down. But in our compost bin, what we're looking to do is have food sit here a couple months, then move it, sit a couple months, and then move it. So is a log really going to be what you want in there? Probably not. There's also some things like citrus that are typically not recommended to compost because they take a while to break down. And while that is true, it's not going to ruin your compost pile if you do have something that happens to take a while to break down. Avocado pits are also something people recommend not having, because at the end of the day, they will sprout up in your compost pile. So you could save yourself some time and just throw those pits away instead of composting them. But, you know, we're a little flexible on that. So, you know, there's a standard guide, but ultimately there's a lot of exceptions, and we'd be happy to talk you through them if there's things you want to compost but aren't sure about. And then when you look at the second bin here, it's a bit empty for us right now since we're having most of our food waste either in our first bin or things that are mostly broken down in our last bin. But the goal with this kind of middle one is that as food is breaking down, you can transition it here and assess if you need to add more carbon at this time. You can even add some worms to it throughout this process to help speed it up. So it's just a good way to help the process move smoothly, because if you only have two bins, you know, you've got new inputs of food waste, and then you have your final bin, which is what you want to put in your garden. So you have to think, how do you keep those separate so you go from food waste to this nice soil, which we will show you here. So this is where you finally want to move your food waste. And to keep track of, you know, food safety aspects of this, like, you know, the molds and microorganisms that help break down our waste aren't necessarily the things we want in our garden beds where we're growing food, right? So it's always good to make sure that there's a 3-month break between when you're adding that food waste in. For example, here, June is the last time we added food waste. So you want to make sure you give that 3 months, so then we wouldn't take it back out to put it in the garden for another 3 months. And if you have animal manure, you have to wait even longer, like I mentioned earlier. So that's the 3-step compost method. Depending on what you're composting, depending on your weather, how much water you add, how much you mix it up and aerate it. It all depends on how long that process is actually going to take for you. But for us, especially in the summertime, it goes pretty quickly and we get a pretty good turnaround with just the 3 months. Another thing you can do if you really want to make some targeted fertilizers, we mentioned this a little bit in our soil workshop. Definitely check that out if you want more info. But I'll just briefly mention you could do something like compost your banana peels specifically in a bucket like this or in a jar, and that would turn into compost tea. So then that's like a good potassium input for your plants. Or if you want to use animal manure, that's a great phosphorus input for your plants. So you could really separate how you compost to get more specific. And that's a pretty neat way to compost as well, especially if you want to just try a few specific things without getting into the whole compost system yet. This would be something that I really do recommend. So, if you have common concerns about composting, you're not alone. A lot of questions we get when we show people our compost bins are, how do you keep it from smelling and how do you keep pests out of it and all of these things. So we're going to talk a little more about that right now.
And we'll talk about some concerns that people may have as it relates to composting. Some concerns are different pests such as, maybe insects, bugs, even rodents, as well as smell. And as it relates to smell, you can use a lot of the carbon-rich materials or browns such as mulch, which we have here, for example, as well as other aspects in your garden, like after you harvest corn, the husks are dry, or even dried plants, twigs. You can use that to help with controlling smell. You can also use nitrogen-rich materials such as coffee grounds, which if you like coffee, drink coffee, you can use the coffee filters as well as the coffee grounds to help with the smell. Carbon-rich materials such as cardboard, newspaper, wood chips, corn husks can also help absorb liquids, as many of those nitrogen-rich materials decompose and form that liquid. So those are some ways that you can address the smell. But some ways to address rodents is to first assess or reassess what's actually in your compost. Remember the general things you shouldn't compost. So like meat, for example, that can attract different pests and rodents and different animals. And based on our experiences, by composting things that you generally should compost and avoiding like dairy products or meat products, animal products, we don't have rodents. And when you think of insects, you may think of the black soldier fly larva, which is actually a very good, you would say a beneficial insect with respect to compost. And if you make your way over here, I can show you some of the larvae in here. And black soldier fly larvae, if you can see them in here, so keep going. They're pretty deep inside, but you can see them. They're actually great at facilitating the process of decomposition. And so as you throw in different nitrogen-rich materials, they break them down very quickly, similar to the red wiggler worms or Vermi-Compost. And some people may find that this may be not beneficial if they're planting or they're planning to apply this compost in a very large area. But if you're growing on a smaller scale, applying this with the even though you have black soldier fly larvae is a great addition to your compost and to your garden, because they continue to break down organic material. And the black soldier fly larva also serves as a great input for our chickens. And so if you're looking to create that closed loop system in which input in one part of your garden becomes output for another part of your garden, that's a great way to really create that cycle. So, and you can decrease the amount of money that you may be spending on buying chicken feed by having your own black soldier fly larva production right in your own compost. So you're, people say killing two birds with one stone, but maybe you're feeding two birds with one scone.
Like we mentioned previously, there are different ways that you can use the compost, and one of the ways you can use it is to fertilize your soil. And so what we're doing is we're going to be top dressing this plant. And so what we'll do is just we'll get some compost like this. I'll just kind of add it to the top. Very simple little process. And that just helps bring more nutrients to the soil. Don't forget that the main things to start a compost, all that you need is some kind of food scrap or browns, greens, and we'll have like a little list that will be listed on our social media so that you can look through and see what you can put in your compost and what you can't. So you'll need some of that, some water, air, and just a bin that can hold your compost. And depending on what kind of process you want to go with, you can figure out whichever fits your needs. Also, if you want to buy some compost, you can order some from Atlas Organics or Earthen Organics online.
And thank y'all for watching this gardening workshop on compost. We'd like to thank our sponsors of this program, the Backyard Garden Program, including Keep Greenville County Beautiful, as well as Fall for Greenville. And as an update, this will be the last gardening workshop in our series for the year. And if you'd like to watch the previous ones, they are available on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube channel. And you can also access this through our Instagram, through our LinkedIn. And we'll be back next year. Thank you.